privilege to have very personalities joining us for today's conference. This is the second in the series for us. The last one we had was, we had in attendance a representative of a YEHAGA and some other civil society groups. Today, we have our own distinguished Senator Ike Ikwerimadu, former Deputy President of the Senate of Nigeria, and Senator representing the Federal Republic of Nigeria, because it has gone beyond the Enugu, I think, West Senatorial District now, South. And let me talk briefly about Senator Ikwerimadu. He's been very much involved in electoral reforms, constitution review, and he is one of the longest serving senators in our country. We are very privileged and delighted to have you, sir. Thank you for joining us on, today, participating in our webinar. We are very, very grateful and delighted. Good morning, sir.
My pleasure.
We also have the executive director of OSIWA, who is Open Society Initiative for West Africa. We have Aisha Osori, who is the executive director. Aisha is a renowned lawyer in Nigeria, human rights defender. Aisha has been on, fighting both constitution issue and also not just only women issue, which many Nigerians know her for. She has written books, including the popular one, I think, is it Politics is Not Love or Love is Not Politics? I think she will talk a bit about that. So we are very delighted to have Aisha. Aisha, you're welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So straight away, we're going to go into the topic of the day. What we have is electoral reform in Nigeria. We are looking at, the expectation from the National Assembly, the commitment of the National Assembly and the expectation from the people of Nigeria. But as our tradition, we would like first to have an overview of your own thoughts on what is actually going on and what represents electoral reform and some of the things that you think we can do. So I'll be starting with Senator Ike Ikwerimadu to first give us his own thoughts and overview on this topic. Thank you very much, sir. Senator.
You're welcome. Can you hear me clearly?
Very well, sir. We can hear you loud and clear, sir. Okay,
thank you. First, let me welcome our sister Aisha, and then thank Rio for bringing me into this conversation. I will try as much as possible to summarize what we've done in terms of electoral reform from 2010 to date in few minutes, and then I will look at what we are doing presently, especially in regards to the Electoral Act of 2019, and then I'll summarize by looking at some of my thoughts on issues which we need to still discuss and possibly consider to be part of our electoral system. First thing we did, meanwhile, I've been a part of the electoral reform since 2007, and I recall that in 2008 I attended the convention, the Democratic Convention in Denver, regarding the nomination of the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. And so when I came back, I decided, as a matter of fact, to bring in some of my findings and experience to form part of our electoral system. So we drafted then the Electoral Act, which ultimately was passed in 2010. With that, my visit in mind, studying the American electoral system. Regrettably, my colleagues found it to be far-reaching at the time, and so we had to water it down. But I'm happy that most of the provisions we came up with are mainly captured in Section 87 of the Electoral Act of that year, which has meant the law for today, until today. Now, from then onwards, we've been working on electoral reforms, both at the constitutional level and the level of the Electoral Act. So in summary, what we've done so far is, first of all, to identify the critical institutions of democracy and begin to strengthen them. One is the National Assembly, that's the Parliament, and the other is the judiciary, and of course, the electoral management body, the Independent Electoral Commission. So our first effort was to ensure that they are sufficiently independent of the executive to avoid interference. So we created the financial autonomy for the Parliament, financial autonomy for the judiciary, and financial autonomy for the electoral management body, that Independent National Electoral Commission. So their funds are now the first line charge in the country's budgetary process. So thereafter, we started to create, under Section 160, in the case of INEC, to give them powers to make its own rules, otherwise regulate its own procedure, and which should not be subject to approval of the president. So some kind of administrative and political independence for INEC to enable them to function optimally. We also amended Section 156 of the Constitution to ensure that a person who is not appointed, a member of the INEC can, on the basis of this, belong to a political party. What this means is that if you're a member of a political party, you cannot be appointed a member of the Independent Electoral Commission. Prior to that, under Section 156 of the Constitution, you are required to have the qualification of a member of the House of Representatives for you to be a member of the Independent Electoral Commission. And one of the conditions for you to be a member of the House of Representatives was to be a member of a political party. And that means you must be a member of a political party for you to be a member of the Independent Electoral Commission, if that qualification holds. So we altered Section 156 to remove that aspect. So that means that today, for you to be a member of the Electoral Commission, you don't need to qualify to be a member of the House of Representatives. Well, specifically, we said in that section, on the amendment, that if you are going to be appointed a member of the Independent Electoral Commission, you cannot by any means be a member of a political party. Now, we also amended Section 66(1)H and Sections 107H. We deleted them essentially to ensure that a person is not disqualified from contesting elections simply on the basis of an indictment by an administrative panel of inquiry. You recall that prior to that, most states, indeed even the federal government, set up some kangaroo administrative panels to disqualify their so-called political enemies. So we believe that was a witch hunt. And so we decided to delete Section 66(1)H and Section 107(1)H regarding the states from the Constitution. So maybe only a judicial panel of inquiry can indict someone, and that can be upheld as a reason for being disqualified from contesting an election, but certainly not any result of any administrative panel. Section 285 of the Constitution and 6th schedule to the Constitution were also altered to reduce the number of members and quorum of election petition tribunals. Prior to that, we used to have 5 members as panelists, but today, after that amendment, we reduced it to 3 members. The essence is to have enough people who will be available for the tribunal matters. Section 285 was also altered to provide a time limit for the filing and examination of election petitions, 180 days for the tribunal to complete its work, and 60 days for consequent appeals, either at the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court, especially in the case of the governor's election, which gets to the Supreme Court. So this brought about faster adjudication of election disputes. Further, in the 8th Senate, we amended Section 285, the 8th National Assembly, we amended Section 285 to provide a timeline of also 180 days for the termination of pre-election disputes, and appeals arising therefrom will be disposed of within 60 days from the date of filing. Then, remember too that before we started all this process, political parties received money as grants or subventions from the government. We discovered that what was happening at the time was people were just filing application for the registration of political parties so they can get these grants. So we removed that aspect from the Constitution. And what happened, it brought some sanity. But for that, they started registering political parties again, this time to afford them negotiations with viable political parties. And then what we now did was to amend the Section 285 further, as you are aware presently, that such that if you go and contest the election and you're unable to win in the case of presidential election, 25% of any state, then you'll be deregistered, or you run election for the National Assembly and are able to win any seat to the National Assembly, you're also disqualified. And if you run for councillorship election, if your party runs for a council for state assembly election and able to win 25% in any part of that state, any local government from that state, then you will be disqualified, you will be deregistered. Or if you field candidates for House of Assembly in a state and you're unable to win one seat, then you are also deregistered. So the same applies to local government election. If you're able to win one councillorship seat in the assembly in the council, you will also be deregistered. The matter went to court, and I'm sure that you are aware that the court said yes, that is an appropriate thing regarding our electoral reforms, and that it has been signed by the president, and that is the law. Now, the time frame for election was also amended regarding section 76(2), 1162, 132, 132 to 1782 to give INEC more room to conduct the election. Prior to that, elections have to be conducted not earlier than 60 days and not earlier than 30 days to the end of the term of the office holders. But now, you have to be held at not earlier than 150 days and not earlier than 30 days. So these are giving them enough opportunity to conduct sufficient election, but it's still a work in progress. So we're going to look at that later. The age qualification for election was also reduced. The not too young to run bill was also passed. So now, for you to run for president or governor or senate, you just have to be just 35 years. And in case of the House of Assembly and House of Reps, I think it's now 25 years. Now, the period for conduct of runoff elections was also amended in section 134, 179, and 225 of the Constitution to extend from 7 days to 21 days. So if no clear winner has emerged, instead of conducting the election within 7 days, which the Constitution provided, we have extended it to 21 days to give INEC sufficient room to conduct an acceptable rerun election. And of course, I've talked about the deregistration of political parties. In the case of the Electoral Act, we've made a lot of progress. Under Section 31 of the Act, INEC was barred from rejecting or disqualifying any candidate submitted by a political party. Prior to this, INEC had the authority to disqualify a candidate, but we felt that this was unacceptable. So we had to prevent interference by INEC in the internal affairs of the parties, such that INEC cannot now disqualify any candidate. It has its own problems anyway, but I think that's a better position. Now, they also provided a window for direct primaries under Section 87 of the Electoral Act. Then we also removed INEC officials as respondents to election petitions to avoid crowding of the election petitions. So only if you just file action against INEC and put INEC as a respondent, that's sufficient. Now, remember too that in the 8th Senate, we passed a number of amendments as well, both in the Constitution and in the Electoral Act that were not signed into law. Let me just quickly go through some of them. One is the issue of the independent candidates. We amended Section 7, 65, 106, 131, 177, and 228 of the Constitution to provide for independent candidates. This will expand the political space and give the electorate broader options. Regrettably, that was not signed. Then, of course, we require that the voters register need to be displayed online so that political parties and individuals can see the names of the electorates. So you don't need to travel long distances to go and check the voters register. Then remember that issue that arose in Kogi was also addressed because of the replacement of a deceased candidate. So we amended Section 36 of the Electoral Act to take care of the situation where a candidate dies before an election is concluded and result announced. In that case, the election will be suspended for 21 days, and the political party whose candidate has died will conduct fresh primaries within 14 days and submit a new name to the INEC. And then prior to 2000, in 2010 Electoral Act, we outlawed the use of electronic means to conduct elections. But subsequently, shortly before the 2015 election, I think it was March of that year, we amended the Electoral Act to allow INEC the discretion to adopt electronic means in conduct of the elections, and that has remained the law till today. And then, of course, Section 87 also dealt extensively regarding the the conduct of primaries. So if you adopt direct primaries, procedures are spread out. If you want to do indirect primaries, it's also spread out. It seems to me that it's only the APC that have now accepted the use of direct primaries for the conduct of his primaries to elect his candidates. So, but it's something that I'm sure that we need to fine tune. Now, finally, I would like to tell you some of my thoughts on the things that we can do to also add value to our electoral process. I believe that the... Are you still hearing me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You hearing me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Continue, sir. Yes.
Okay. So I said that
yes,
the conduct of party primaries. Today, the primaries are conducted by the respective political parties. But I think that we need to make progress. My suggestion here is that the primaries should be conducted by Independent Electoral Commission. We need to expand the powers and functions of the Independent Electoral Commission to include the conduct of primaries for political parties. And that is the practice in Ghana. And it's brought some kind of sanity in their primaries. So it's something we need to look at in our own jurisdiction. Of course, the compulsory use of electronic voting. Now it is optional, but I think INEC will now determine if they want to use it. But I believe that is something we can make compulsory and then assist INEC to acquire sufficient capacity to deal with this. With this age of card technology, I think it makes sense that electronic voting should be adopted so there will be no issue of a doubt who had won an election and who didn't win. And everybody will follow through the process and see a candidate who is winning or who is losing. And once you've won or lost, you'll be able to accept the result because it is sufficiently transparent. Because especially in a country such as Nigeria, which is quite large, so I think that if we're able to do this, the issue of collation and announcement of results will be a matter of 24 hours. Now, of course, each political party should be expected to have an electronic register of his parties, of his of these members. The essence of this is that for you to conduct an acceptable direct primaries, you must have an acceptable register. And this acceptable register can only be guaranteed by electronic means, so that you can now know the number of members you have, and then you know when they are voting and how they are voting, and you'll be able to collect the result. Now, some people may argue that some people will be disfranchised because of their level of education exposure. Now, if you look at the elections we've had in the past, I'm not sure any election has recorded up to 50% turnout. So if we have a process that is transparent and we're able to record about 20 to 30% participation, I think, and it's acceptable and transparent and gives us the correct result, I think that is better than what we are doing now, where we model up everything. At the end of the day, everybody now ends up in the tribunal. Now, the other issue is the issue of early primaries. Today, our primaries are usually too close to the election. And you can see that all the disputes arising from it will also end up either in the election or thereafter, continuing thereafter. So even with the efforts to say that their timelines to conclude the pre-election matters, now we still have the issues right there. But I think if we do early primaries to help us to resolve all issues regarding the primaries before the election itself is conducted. In the USA, primaries start about 12 months to the presidential election and ultimately climax with a convention. It's also the practice in Ghana. If you look at Article 11(2)B of the Constitution of the National People's Party in Ghana and Article 2B of the Constitution of the National People's Party, NPP, it provides that parliamentary candidates shall be elected at least 12 months before the national general election, while Article 12 provides that a presidential primary shall be held not later than 24 months, that is 2 years, from the date of national elections. What this means is therefore you know your candidates early enough, the people know them, they begin to interrogate them early, and then you begin to prepare your plans and your programs and your campaign sufficiently early so that there will be no disruption ahead of the election. When this matter was discussed in the last retreat of the INEC in Lagos, I was present. And the argument that some people are saying, oh, if you do the primaries early enough, what happens that the candidate will start spending money early, he'll kill two cows every day, and you multiply the number of cows that will be killed before the election, and it becomes quite unreasonable. But we must still kill a cow. Killing a cow is essentially your own option. So if you start to be killing 10 cows a day, that's your own business. So, but you should be able to focus on your policies, your programs, your manifesto. And I think that's what the people are interested in, not just essentially cow. So we need to forget about this cow stuff. The other one is the issue of a staggered or phased primaries. The idea of bringing people together in one place or doing the direct primaries in one day is it causes a lot of problems itself, and it's an invitation to anarchy. So the best way to resolve it is to have a staggered or phased primaries, as they do in the US. So they go from state to state in case of presidential primaries. And if you are 20 or 30, that starts the race. By the time you go halfway, you will advise yourself to stop, and nobody will going to advise you. So it's not a matter of where you bring everybody to Abuja or somewhere, and then it becomes very contentious, and that contention goes into the election. Most people who lost in that sort of primaries will stage a walkout. Some will not participate in the election itself, and then it creates a lot of problem. But if you on your own, because you've not been able to meet up halfway and then you drop, I think you now decide whom to support to the end. So I think staggered and phased primaries can help us, especially with regards to governorship and presidential primaries.
Thank you, sir.
Now, okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Let's pause a bit there because we know this is going to be a very interesting conversation. I know the time is also very tight. We actually appreciate the historical perspective.
Okay, let me just in outline mention two or three more issues. One is the issue of single term of office and zoning of presidency, and then proportional representation, and of course, finally, diaspora voting. So I'm not going to elaborate on this. Maybe in the course of the discussion, I'll be able to throw more light on all these issues.
Okay, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are very glad. And like I said, this is a very interesting conversation. Senator Ikulimadu, of course. And on another day, we are still going to talk about feeding bottle federalism.
Thank you.
Well done for that. Yeah, thank you very much, sir. So now we are moving to Aisha Osori to also give us our own perspective and overview on this conference. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Korimadu, for your presentation. It was quite interesting, quite technical. And so I'm glad that you focused on that side, because I think mine is going to go more to the spirit of what elections could be and why electoral reform is important. So I'd like to start with saying, what makes a credible elections? I mean, because behind the intent to reform, to amend our electoral bill is the sense that our elections should be a lot better. The elections should be less violent, should be more transparent, should be more credible. So how do you know when an election is actually credible? What are the elements of credible elections? And there are like 7 of them. One is empowerment. So that's the first one. The conditions should be empowering, which means voters can wield their votes as they please, freely. And we know that we can't do that in Nigeria because if we use the 2019 elections, for example, we found that there was lots of violence. In fact, we saw an escalation of violence that we haven't seen in quite a while, including, sadly, the rape of INEC staff and the murders of INEC staff, and then just willful destruction of ballot materials. So it was a very violent election, our last elections. The second element of a credible election is free supply, meaning that citizens must be free to form and join and support any parties, any candidates they want. So this is one element as well. The third element is free demand. Citizens must be able to learn about available alternatives. They should know, which means that basically the conditions for campaigning should be free and fair. So when we hear all these stories of one state not allowing opposition parties to use convention centers or stadiums, or when we hear that airports are closed mysteriously around the time when opposition are supposed to be landing there, all those things speak to free demand. The fourth condition is inclusion. So citizens have equal rights of participation and representation, and there's no legal or pseudo-legal restrictions on the ability to campaign or to participate or to vote, which speaks maybe to the money aspects, which speaks to the age aspects in terms of the age eligibility requirements. So that's one element as well. The fifth element is insulation. So meaning citizens must be free to express their electoral preferences and must not be coerced or intimidated. I think this speaks to the actual voting day. So we've made a lot of song and dance about, protecting your vote, not selling your vote. But when you have, in a sense, community rigging, so to speak, where people know that there's a way of making people show how they voted, in which way they voted, because they know that they're going to pay repercussions either in terms of how the state deals with their chiefs or their emirs or their obas or whatever. So that's the insulation that's missing. The sixth element of credible election is integrity. So basically, we know that it's one person, one vote. I do not think we can say so in Nigeria. If you read the reports from the Center for Democracy and Development, or if you read the EU's report, collation is the black hole of Nigerian elections. We do not know what happened in there. So it is impossible right now to say that we have integrity in our elections where it's one person, one vote. And then the final element of credible election is irreversibility, meaning that when the elections take place, there are consequences. The people that were elected into those offices can take those offices. And the use of violence or the use of changing results will not happen. Again, we cannot say that with any certainty in Nigeria. Now, so it is in this context that we must talk about why electoral reform is important. And I have three examples for those who are listening so that they can share this with other people in terms of one of the most important things we should be discussing in Nigeria right now is electoral reform, because every governance issue that we have problems with is tied to the quality of our leadership and is tied to the people who are in government making policy. So our elections are becoming increasingly contested so that it's really the courts and its violence that are determining who wins elections. So for example, in the 2019 elections, we had over 800 pre-election matters. And I think this speaks to what the senator was talking about when he said, if we have our primaries earlier, then maybe all these contentious court cases will be dealt with quickly and more speedily. But just put that in your mind, over 800 pre-election matters. The only people who are winning here are the lawyers and the judges. Then after the elections, we had over 700 election petitions. So now these two things, the violence and the courts, they do two things for us. It delegitimizes the government that comes in. They know it, we all know it, and then they have thin skins. They're always suspicious of criticism. They don't want to be criticized because they know exactly how they got into power. They know that they're not quite legitimate, and so everything is an offense to them. Everything they must push back, everything they must defend, and they must make sure that they try to reduce people's powers to speak freely. They reduce free speech, you see the crackdown on bloggers. So if you notice the trend after 2015 elections and even after 2019 elections, we saw more interest in social media bills, you saw more interest in hate speech bills. All of it is just designed to make sure we don't say the truth, which they don't want to hear. And then the second thing is, obviously with this type of elections that we keep having, we can see that if you analyze our voter turnout over the years since 1999, even though we keep saying that the number of people who are registered, 84 million, the last count, it's 4 million Nigerians are now registered voters. You find that each election cycle, we are seeing less and less Nigerians coming out to vote. What explains this? What explains it is loss of belief. People no longer trust the system. People no longer trust the elections. People are noticing that despite all the elections we keep having, despite how expensive our elections are, the last bill was about 254 billion naira, which comes to over $650 million. You can imagine how much that money would do for our hospitals and our schools. We spend that all on elections that are still not legitimate. Now, the reason why it's important again to talk about electoral reforms is because our elections are not credible, because our elections are not legitimate, the social contract between citizens and those who govern us is broken. Is completely broken. We cannot hold them accountable because they know exactly how they win elections. And so when they get into power, they have no desire to make the policies, put the people's desires in priority when they're spending their security votes or when they're budgeting for things. They put themselves first because they know that there's nothing we can do to get them out of office. And then the third reason that's important for electoral reform is because if we don't get this right, everything we're complaining about, everything from the fact that our police don't protect us, to the fact that our cabals have taken over almost every institution, to the fact that the insecurity is rising, the fact that kidnapping is a $20 million business in Nigeria, all those things are tied to our elections. They're tied to how people come into power. They're tied to how people wield power. So that's why electoral reform is important. And you can add any other reasons why you think so, but those three are the most important ones. So I've gone through the 2019 amendment bill. I won't go into it in any detail because the senator did, but I'll say that a few things struck me. And I felt as I read it that yes, there are many technicalities that were dealt with that are necessary, how to deal with candidates who die, how to outline how primaries happen. But I also thought about it, Nigeria, we have so many laws laws are not actually too much of our problem. The issue is actually the spirit and the intent behind our laws. What is the spirit behind how elections are held? So you can have all these good things. So for example, while on one hand, you'd like to think that electronic voting is a good thing, the truth is we should be very wary and we should be very suspicious unless the spirit and intent, unless the culture of being in power changes. The only thing that electronic voting is going to do is, one, increase the price tag of elections. So if we were spending 650 million, you can bet that that money is going to go up. And two, they will just find a way of still rigging it electronically. We've seen that in other jurisdictions. In many countries around the world, electronic voting is something that people use when they're just tired of people making so much noise about elections that are not credible. So they bring in technology in a way that makes it seem as if it's going to be transparent, but these things are rigged from the setup. So you should be looking at the clues. Who is going to get the contract? Is it going to be a foreigner? What foreign company? How was the procurement process? How transparent it was? You know, we should be asking, we will have to ask all those questions. So I'm just saying to Nigerians, as you either agree or not agree for electronic voting, ask the right question, because having electronic voting will not take away the cheating and rigging mentality, which is ingrained in our elections and has been a feature of our elections since 1960. So for me, what would be more interesting would be the things that are not in the bill. And I'll just list them and then I will close. So the things that are not in the bill that I would wish were on the bill is, why are we not discussing holding elections on one day? Why are Nigerians not suspicious about the fact that when the last National Assembly put that in the amendment bill that the president refused to sign before the 2019 elections, there was a huge uproar? We should know that this whole thing of who comes first, whether the president comes first or the governors come first, is all part of the rigging culture of elections. They want to make sure that the president is delivered before the governors can now do what they like. We as Nigerians should be demanding that we want elections on one day because of many things, including that, but also the expense, also the disruption to our lives. Don't forget that when we have elections, the whole country shuts down, which is not what happens in other countries. So we should be asking ourselves, why can't we have elections on one day? The second thing we should be looking at in terms of electoral reform is independent candidacy. I know that the Senator mentioned it, but we should be demanding it. Because the truth is, we will still have no control over what the parties do, whether it's MPN or UPN or AC or ACN or PDP, they all function the same way. We cannot guarantee that what they do in the primaries will ever be transparent. The only pressure that they need is to see that Nigerians can run on their own platforms without having to go through the parties. The second thing that we should be talking about that's not in the bill and might not be able to be in the bill, but how do we demilitarize our elections? Because we also know that the police and the army are usually deployed to keep incumbents in power, depending on who they are. How do we get rid of that part of our elections? How do we ensure that the military are not there to protect the regime, but are actually there to protect the votes of the people, the one person, the one vote that we talked about? That's very important. How do we remove the incentives for violent elections? So maybe making all the public security arrangements public. When we go into this song and dance of bringing contestants of parties together to talk about eschewing violence, we tell them, oh, sign this document, you're not going to be violent, or you're going to tell your supporters not to be violent. Why don't we do that for the police and the military? Why don't we put them two in a room and say, you guys are not going to kill Nigerians, you guys are not going to go into ballot collation centers and snatch boxes, or now the special one is they'll tell you that, oh, the men in uniform were not really members of the police force, or the men in uniform were not part of the security. I mean, what kind of country are we running? We need to be asking those questions, and we need to be demanding them of our legislators. What are they going to do to make sure that our elections are run more with less violence and with less partiality from our security forces? The fifth thing I want to talk about is collation. Collation is the black hole of Nigerian elections. And I agree that maybe electronic voting would solve this problem, but it's definitely something, if for now, it is still in the bill that we cannot, electronic voting is a voluntary provision, it's not compulsory. We still have to deal with collation and the way collation happens. Should we be sending our ward results, local polling unit results electronically to a database that INEC cannot, and I saw that in the bill, that INEC cannot say they've shut down How do we make sure that INEC will be able to hold collation centers to account? How do we make sure that collation is more transparent? How do we even publish our election results afterwards, even if it's 3 years after, even if it's 1 year after? Can we publish them on the website so that me, my polling unit X, one day when I'm tired or I'm bored, I can go there, click on it and say, okay, this is the result I stayed behind and counted. You cannot tell Nigerians, stay in your polling unit, protect your vote. It is a charade, it is a joke of the highest order to tell us to wait in our polling units to make sure that the ballots are counted. But then after that, I can never ever verify that when that result went to a different collation center, whether on the ward level or local government level or state level, that number never changed. So it's a mockery and we need to deal with that. The sixth thing is that INEC must improve its logistics, operations, and planning and tracking. We do not know what needs to be done. We're not the ones in charge of INEC, but that must absolutely be dealt with. Maybe it is going to be tied to who we employ or who gets to be the INEC chairman. I don't see, and I think many people have made this point, we don't see the link between being a professor, an academic, or a judge and running literally what is a logistics affair. What we need is people who have experience in logistics or who at least have the humility to hire logistics companies to do these things. But the way that we do our logistics is actually also designed to be opaque and is all part of the rigging process to make sure that opposition areas don't get their ballot material ahead of time, or whether they can be diverted. All those things should be dealt with. Those are the things we should be talking about. And then finally, we need to amend our constitution. If we don't amend our constitution to remove the incentives for bandits to want to be in government, we're going to continue having this problem, which is why I spoke in the beginning about the spirit. We can have the spirit of the law and we can have the paper, the words in the law. Any system that we have in Nigeria where the worst of us are determined to get into government and have access to public funds, we're going to be having problems. No matter what we do, they will find a way of gaming that system. So we must be very vigilant. Electoral reform cannot be on its own. It has to come hand in hand with constitutional reform. And then long term, there are three things. So for me, that's more immediate. These are the immediate things that we need to do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aisha. I think, just like I said, we have two very important people who have deep insight into electoral reforms and issue of constitution in Nigeria. Quickly, we will now go to Senator Ike Ikurimadu. Sir, there are certain things that Nigerians are actually expecting from this advocacy. And that is exactly what probably we seek to achieve. Now, Nigerians want to know the commitment of the 9th National Assembly to electoral reform. Nigerians are eager to have electoral reforms. And in addition to that, there are very important, suggestions that Nigerians are craving for. Issue of electronic transmission of results, full biometrics, and also the one that Aisha mentioned, which is having all elections in one day. These are very important things that Nigerians are looking forward to, including some of the other things that beautiful sections, suggestions that you also mentioned, the amendment that have been made in the past that you mentioned. So Nigerians would like to hear from Senator Ikurimadu, what's for you to assure Nigerians that actually we can have this bill passed quickly and at the same time have these very important sections.
All right, thank you so much. I'm not holding brief for the National Assembly, but I can say clearly that there is commitment on the part of the leadership of the National Assembly to have these the Electoral Act 2019 passed as soon as possible. Because if it's not passed before the middle of next year, then it becomes contentious as always. So the idea of starting early is to ensure that it's passed sufficiently early. Because these, the Electoral Act amendment of the 2019 is essentially in some particulars with the Electoral Act of 2018, which was not signed. So I had expected probably that what the leadership of National Assembly would have done is just to tidy it up. If there are concerns, the Committee on Electoral Matters should be able to tidy it up, present it to the National Assembly, and then we'll fast track it, and within a month, you should be ready with it and send it to the President for assent. because the president didn't have much objection to the last version. He was essentially saying that it's coming too late in the day to sign it. And of course, you are aware of the protocol on good governance in West Africa, which says that you cannot amend the electoral process a few months before the election. So that's understandable. But I had expected that with the coming into force of the President National Assembly, the way to go would have been to just clean up that bill and send to the president for assent. We won't be talking about concluding in good time by now. Maybe it would have been a law by now. We'll be practicing it, and then especially with these off-season elections to see how it works. So that is my take on that. But I just want to say that the process is on. I attended a retreat with the Independent Electoral Commission in Lagos in February in consideration of this particular bill. So maybe because of this COVID-19, they have not been able to make so much progress. But I think that it's something that the National Assembly is committed to and be able to conclude before the end of the year. The other issue you talked about is the transmission of results. It's been taken care of in the present Electoral Act that's been considered. So it's going to be transmitted by electronic means, so because that's part of the idea of saying, let us conduct our election by electronic means, electronic voting. So that includes the transmission of the results. So we expect that by the time this Electoral Act is passed, that it will form part of the electoral process. Now, our sister spoke about holding election in one day. There's nothing problematic about that. There's nothing, we don't need to enact any new law in that respect, because if you look at our constitution, in all sections regarding the time for election, if you look at section 76, one of the constitution, it said that the electoral management body will conduct the election to the National Assembly or the date in a date determined by Independent Electoral Commission. So if the Electoral Commission decides on their own to conduct all the elections one day, they're not flouting any regulation, any law. They are not disobeying any law, and they are not offending any constitutional provision. So it's up to them to conduct the election one day if they so desire. So, but now it says that though the fixing of the date for election should be in accordance with the Electoral Act. What has happened, as he really identified, is that subsequent governments tried to create advantage from themselves by insisting the Electoral Act to provide the order of the election, in which case they always want the presidential election to hold. So with the absence of that particular provision in the Electoral Act, the Independent Electoral Commission is empowered under our Constitution to hold the elections either in different days or in one day. So it's already part of our Constitution. So it's something we can look at. So if in the course of considering the present Electoral Act, and the Nigerian public is of the view that that aspect of putting the order of election should be removed, then that now gives INEC the opportunity to hold the election either in a staggered manner or in one day. So that is the situation with that. So there's no law that stops the INEC from holding the whole election in one day. So I agree with that. That can be done, So, and of course, speaking again about the electronic voting, I do believe that the technology is evolving, so it may not be perfect, and it's not perfect anyway. So if we have issues with the electronic voting, that's understandable. But I believe over time we overcome that. But I think it's better than what we are doing presently. If look at what happens in the banks, if you do any transaction, you get an alert as soon as possible. In fact, in real time. So if that can happen with banking activities in Nigeria, then it means it can happen with the electoral activity as well. So I have suggested to INEC severally, why don't you use off-season elections and test run some of these technologies, or just do a mock election and let's see how it works. So over time you perfect it. So if you continue to say that it has problem, every policy will of course come with a problem. But how do you overcome this problem? And that's the challenges of leadership. So we expect the INEC leadership to deal with it and be able to overcome, and that's why I can have a perfect election, which all of us can be certain, about the outcome.
Senator, sir, before I go to Aisha, let me quickly call your attention to two things. Yes, number one is the fact that on the issue of electronic transmission, electronic transmission is not on Senator Omagege's bill. What is there is full biometrics. I know that it is on the one that the 8th Senate did, electronic transmission is there. So Are you going to assure us that when during the deliberation, you are going to ensure that we have, in case it is the Omoagege's bill that will be considered by the Senate, because I heard that there are more than 1 or 2 bills in the National Assembly to this effect. Are you going to assure Nigerians that you are going to be an apostle of this important crusade of having electronic transmission of results in whichever bill that is eventually considered by the National Assembly? That's number one. Then number two, it's also very important that to also inform you that we heard from the National Assembly, the Senate specifically, that they are considering what you call repeal and reenact. So they want to repeal the entire Electoral Act and reenact a new one, so that if it is Electoral Act 2020, and stop the idea of amendment, Electoral 2010 as amended, because of a lot of confusions that have been identified in the past, that different versions of this law are with different people. So let's hear your response before I come to Aisha.
Okay, now, you see, the part of our problem as a nation is that it will bring in so much emotions in matters considering reforms. So it's either our ethnic emotions, our political party emotions, or maybe our gender emotions. Now, the problem here is that you recall in the last Senate, the APC colleagues, they had a lot of issues with some of the reforms we proposed in the Electoral Act. And now that was part of the problem we had in the 8th Assembly. So, and my friend Omar Agege was in the forefront of that agitation, believing that, creating the impression that the Electoral Act were then amending, were then proposing, was actually targeted at the president, which of course is unfortunate, because there was no such thing, because an Electoral Act will also outlive every president. So, and that's what it's supposed to be. So now, when we came into this 9th Assembly, so he quickly came up with his own version that excluded some of those things he considered were targeted at the president. So what they are talking about the electronics transmission, he carefully excluded it from his own proposed amendment. So, but you remember, it's the way parliamentary work, how they work in the National Assembly. At the end of the day, it's still going to come to the Assembly, and then we're going to look at the thing clause by clause. So we're going to ensure that it's restored. But remember that the issue of lawmaking goes beyond the National Assembly. There's also collective effort, including the civil society, need to make their own input, and of course, especially during the public hearing. So that will also help to organize the law itself. Ultimately, by the time the bill is passed, it will have an input of most Nigerians, especially when we conduct a good public hearing. So there's nothing to worry about. It's work in progress. By the time we finish, we hope that some of those concerns would have been addressed. So it's just a proposal. That's why it's called a bill. By the time it becomes an act of National Assembly, I'm sure it will be well interrogated, and the input of civil society and Nigerians will be taken care of. Now, on the issue of the repeal and reenactment, I support that process, because between 2010 and now, there have been a number of amendments, some of which Nigerians don't even know. When we amended the Section 52 to allow INEC to consider electronics voting, most Nigerians didn't even know. Even most of our colleagues did not even know. They couldn't recollect. And that's why even in the 2018 proposal, they were still talking about electronics voting, amending Section 52, which was already amended, and President Goodluck Jonathan assented to it before that election. So some of these problems emanate because we only have several amendments to an act of National Assembly. Sometimes confusion sets in, So what therefore happens is that if we go to the way of repeal and reenactment, we can now have all the provisions in one act of National Assembly, so that I don't begin to refer to different amendments. So I think that's a better option.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me quickly go to Aisha, but if you want to put on your video, I think you can check. I think the video thing it's working now if you want to put the video on, so that the participant can. And okay, we can see you, sir. I think the participant will be happy now to see you, sir. Okay, Aisha,
thank you.
Want to put on your video. So let me go back to Aisha. Nigerians, like I said, are eager to have electoral reforms. We have COVID-19, which has reduced our, financial capacity. We have Edo, what is going on in Edo. We have some of those problems that you have also identified. How soon do you think we should have this Electoral Act? Since we have Senator Ekulemadu, who will definitely be the ambassador of Nigerians in the Senate for us to quickly have this law passed. What do you think should be the timeline for the National Assembly to quickly pass this? Because we already missed testing the Electoral Act in Edo and Ondo State. What are going to be your suggestions?
Well, thank you, Ariel. I think I'd recommend that by the end of the year, because we're already halfway through the year, there should be enough time between now and the end of the year to have all the stakeholders who need to be involved come in and review the bill, whether it's the public, whether it's civil society, do the public hearings, and maybe even do a sort of roadshow, go from place to place. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it might be impossible to have those face-to-face meetings, but we're having webinars these days where there's up to 300 people who are on a call. So maybe that's another way to do it. But for me, honestly, I think despite wanting this to be passed as soon as possible, hearing what the senator said about, yes, the Africa Commission's rules on and guidelines on democracy and changing constitutions and changing electoral laws when it's close to elections. If we do this now, by the end of this year, latest first quarter of 2021, we will find that we will be able to have the discussions we need to have. Parties, people, citizens will be able to understand what's in the law. I also agree with Senator Ekulemadu that we should repeal and reenact and just have whether it's a 2020 bill, no longer an amendment to 2010. We need to bring all those amendments together and have one bill. As much as I'd like this to happen within the next 6 to 9 months, I also think we should do it thoroughly. There are many aspects of this that still need to be looked on. I think there's electronic transmission of results to collation centers in the Omar Agege bill, if you look at sections 49 and 63, but it's still not, in my mind, wide enough. There's still, for me, that element of, so we can say that we want results to be transmitted electronically. I like that idea. I think it will help, especially if on the back end, it's an automatic tabulation. What I'm more concerned about is our process. So you know how what we do is we vote and then we count, we accredit, then we vote, then we count later. When people know which areas they're not, when politicians know which areas they're not popular in, they have a way of disrupting those elections. So for me, we need to look at those things and sort of tighten some of the gaps that we know exist.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I know that our senator has a lot of pressing assignment. We will just take 5 minutes more into 10 o'clock. So we should be ending this by 10:05 or 10:10 maximum, because we know it's supposed to be a 1-hour conversation. So since we have you here, one thing that people are looking forward to, just like I said earlier, is the commitment to have this bill passed on time. We heard that the Omar Agege's bill has already entered, I think has been passed for second reading. We want to know what is the current situation, and Nigeria wants to know what's the current situation. Is it that we're waiting for public hearing, or what is actually going on, so that people can have at least some reasonable expectation? Because what has been the concern of Nigerians is that the biggest thing after appropriation bill should actually be the electoral bill, should be the biggest thing, and should be the major thing before the National Assembly. A few days ago, the Senate president went to the president over the problem within his party and in Edo State. Whereas the Senate president should actually be talking about this electoral act, the issue of electoral reform, which will actually address some of these concerns. So Nigerians wants to know what is the current situation in the National Assembly and what should we actually be expecting. I know that you have said that at least, this thing shouldn't go beyond the middle of next year. So what are you going to assure Nigerians? That's the major thing that majority of the participants who are actually listening to you now want to actually hear. They know that opportunity of public hearing and what is the current situation, sir?
Well, as you rightly said, it's gone past the second reading. So it's going to go, it's already in the committee stage. And then it's on account of that INEC had a retreat with the committee, which I'm a member in Lagos, to look at these provisions. I think the confusion here is that our friend, our colleague, the Deputy Senate President, introduced this bill, and in introducing the bill, introduced some new provisions and also removed some provisions from the one that was sent to the President. In fact, stick to that, we send to the president, there won't be any reform because that passed through a public hearing, an extensive public hearing. What we would have done is just to dust it, pass it in quick succession, and then send to the president for his assent. By now, we would have had the act. So what we need to do is to identify those new provisions and then those that were dropped, and see how we can reconcile it with the present amendment proposed. And if we're able to do that, I'm sure that we can quicken the process and send to the president. But I can assure you that the Senate president is committed to this process. And that means that before the end of the year or before the middle of next year, we would have passed it. The only intervening issue will be the long vacation National Assembly, which will start maybe by the end of July and takes us up to September. So, and then when we come back, we'll start dealing with the budget issues, the appropriation bill. So that may affect the quick conclusion of this electoral act. So, but I know that it's a priority for the National Assembly. So, and I can say clearly that before the middle of next year, that we'll be able to conclude work on the Electoral Act, so that we'll be able to see what it looks like ahead of the election, to remove those contentions that comes with amendment of the Electoral Act as we head to the election period. Now, I don't even have another opportunity, but let me quickly say this. It's not just the commitment to pass the Electoral Act or amend the Constitution, to deal with the electoral processes. We must, as a country, obey the laws we make for ourselves. Sometimes we obey this in breach. If you look at Section 76 of the Constitution, the original version says that if there is a vacancy in the National Assembly, for instance, that vacancy must, use the word shall, be filled within 1 month. Now, we consider 1 month as being technical. In one of our earliest amendments, we now defined that clearly and said that if a vacancy occurred in the National Assembly, and that vacancy must be filled within 30 days, not just 1 month, but within 30 days, which is understandable. And everybody can calculate what 30 days means. Now, but between that period and now, what has happened is that if election is cancelled and then the court orders a fresh election, they will now say that the election will be conducted within 90 days. I don't know where they get these 90 days from. It's totally unconstitutional. And INEC themselves have been also making the same mistake, that sometimes the vacancy will occur and they will never do the election. Sometimes it goes up to 1 year. The essence of that provision is that each part of Nigeria is entitled to representation at all material times in the life of the National Assembly. So look at what has happened now. There are about 4 vacancies in the Senate. There's 1 in Imo, there's 2 in Bayelsa, and then there's 1 in Plateau. Now, those parts of Nigeria are not being represented in the National Assembly. And the same 30 months, the 30 days has gone a long time. What is the technical implication? The technical implication is that since the word shall was used, it means therefore that you cannot conduct the elections, constitutionally anytime before 2023. So those people will be out of representation until 2023, because any election you conduct after that 30 days period is null and void. So the truth is that Nigerians have been ignoring that provision of the Constitution. All of us have been ignoring it, but that's very, very critical. So we need to find a way of obeying the laws we make for ourselves. So not just doing electoral reforms, those electoral reforms need to be obeyed. And the operators need to make sure that after all our efforts in amending the Constitution and Electoral Act, that they need to be operationalized. So, and that's where people like you have to come in to push for this. So we cannot be doing laws for ourselves which we cannot obey. Because for every amendment, every provision in the law, there's a reason for it. So otherwise, there's no need to be wasting our time and energy in making sure that these things are done as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, sir. Just 1 minute more of your time. Let me just quickly go to Aisha. Sorry, sir. Please, I know that your time is fast spent.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. Go ahead.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm enjoying a contribution.
Yeah, that's very good, sir. Thank you very much. It's also part of the representation, sir.
Yes.
So, Aisha, it won't be fine if we don't actually bring the question of some of our participants. Somebody is asking, which has also been a major concern in our country, that why can't we have our BVM biometrics and all these connected, so that for issue of good identification, that's why we have the voting card separate, that's the PVC, we have BVN. Why can't we have a sync in a way that probably we can harness technology to have one man, one vote. What's your take on this?
I think it's a great idea. It's not unrelated to the 3 points I said I was going to mention in terms of thinking about long-term, some of the long-term things we need to do to make sure that our elections stay credible. And one of them was to do with voter registration. Voter registration is another event in our timeline for elections that is fraught with all sorts of engineering. So you find that who gets registered, which population, which area, who gets their PVCs, all those things become political. I remember there were lots of complaints in Lagos about certain ethnic groups not being able to get their PVCs. So yes, why can't we have a national ID, or why can't we have a BVN? The reason why I'll be hesitant about BVN is because we know that many of our Nigerians are unbanked right now. Not many Nigerians are banked. It's a minority of us that are banked. So BVN, while a good idea, cannot be the only solution. For me, why do we not have national identity cards that are suitable to vote for? Why do we need to have this expensive process of voter registration where we have the voter registration, what are those things called, the smart card, the BV biometric machines that don't work, the long lines that takes people away from work and school and everything. So yeah, if we just had national ID cards and you show your ID card, it will even take away this issue of people who are underage. Because if you get your national identity card when you're 18, for example, or your driver's license when you're 18, all those things you should be able to use to vote, your BVN, your national ID, your driver's license. We need to move away from voter registration because it's also a way of manning, it's also a traditional way of rigging elections. We need to look closely at that, and it's too expensive. The other two things I wanted to mention was proportional representation. I totally agree with the senator. That should go back in the bill. It has been a steady request since the Uwais reform report of 2007. I think after the 2007 elections, we had the Uwais committee. In their report, they suggested that we have proportional representation. That should go back into the bill. And next, we need to do something to make our INEC really independent. That independence doesn't belong there. So whatever we need to do, whether it's looking at the Ghana model, Ghana has a fairly independent electoral management chair. We need to look at those models and find a way of depoliticizing the leadership of our INEC and really making them, so it speaks to several things, including what the senator talked about in terms of INEC having the power to decide that they're going to have elections on one day. But if the people who put them there say that they shouldn't, then they won't. So we really need independent people, not just the chair, but the commissioners and even the entire staff. We need a complete overhaul of INEC, actually, long term, if we are going to be serious about credible elections.
Thank you, Aisha. I'll come back to you as we're rounding up. Senator, there is one very important thing which I would like to draw your attention to, and that is, there is this thing that happens all the time when we are going closer to election. INEC has this way of that whichever process that is served on it from the court, that's what the latest process, that is what it will be obeyed. INEC has this way of looking at judicial matters. A departure from what normally happens post-election, whereby even if the moment you are elected, you cannot be removed until the final determination of that matter. In the case of lawmakers at a court of appeal, executive, president, governors at the Supreme Court. Now, why can't we have similar things? For instance, the moment INEC monitors a party primary, that the only time that that candidate can be removed is when the final determination of that matter. Why can't we have this? Because we experienced that in Ondo during the last governorship election in Ondo about 4 years ago. We've also experienced it in some states, such that is why you see politicians rushing to court A for injunction, for this and for that. What would you suggest on this in terms of fine-tuning this process, which you are also aware of? Probably you must have one way or the other be affected by it or your political party.
Well, if you look at Section 87 of the Electoral Act, I think towards the end, I think subsection 10 or thereabout, just towards the end of that, you will see a provision to that effect that the courts cannot stop the process of primaries, electing candidates and all that. But I don't know how they get into this business of getting court orders and all that to stop primaries. So that's why we say that it's not just amending these laws. We need to operationalize them. And sometimes most people are not aware of it. You know, you recall that when the issue of deregistration of political parties came up, some people were saying, oh, that is unconstitutional, it's on here and that. Meanwhile, they've not even read the amendment themselves. You know, so but I'm happy that the court came to the rescue and no matter has been resolved. So we need to find a way of making sure that Nigerians are aware of laws that concerns them, that affect their lives, you know. So if we look at that section 87 and if there are still lacunas that need to be filled, I think this is an opportunity why we're considering the present act to make sure that it's filled. But let me say this, I think the president of Nigeria today, he has a life opportunity to do Nigeria a lot of good in terms of electoral reform. He's not coming back again. He's not going to run again. Because the greatest tragedy is when you have a sitting president running for the second term. They do all kinds of manipulations, you know, to make sure that the electoral act favors them. So now that the president is will be leaving at the end of his term, this is an opportunity for him to insist on an appropriate law to put in place that will guide the electoral process. If we don't do that, they're going to miss it for another 8 years. So we need to put pressure on the president to work with the National Assembly to ensure that we have a very responsible and reasonable electoral act that will guide the electoral process. We have a lot of ideas from all parts of the country, from very well-meaning Nigeria, that we can articulate to form the electoral process going forward. So what we need to do is to put the pressure on the president not to interfere, or for him to show commitment in making sure that we have an appropriate electoral act, you know, before he leaves office. Now, finally, let me also elaborate on the issue of proportional representation. So, because it's a technical word, I'm sure our listeners need to understand what we're talking about. So, and it's not just me and Aisha that are talking about. I think a lot of Nigerians are talking about, but it seems that most people don't even understand what it's all about and the implication for us as a country. Now, today, what we do is what we call technically first past the poll. So, if you are running for election, you put yourself out for a particular constituency, and whoever has the largest number of votes becomes the person elected. Now, and then you represent a constituency. Now, in South Africa and most part of East Africa, what they do is this issue of proportional representation. What that means, of course, some West African countries still do that, especially the French-speaking. So what they do is that parties register candidates, they set a list of candidates for legislative seat. Now, the party will conduct the election, or contest those elections. When, at the end of the election, the electoral member body will determine what percentage of that election we are won by different political parties. So if PDP, for instance, wins, say, 70% of the vote cast, PDP will now contribute 70% of members of the National Assembly or State Assembly, as the case may be. If APC wins, say, 20%, now they only contribute just 20%. They will now go to defined. That will have maybe 5% of the women, 6% of disabled people, 7% of youths. All these are defined in the Electoral Act or the regulations. So, and you have to follow this when you submit the list, the final list of those that will represent your party based on the percentage you have scored. So that way, women don't need to go and waste their time looking for money or looking for people to help them for election. All they need to do is to make sure that the party wins, and then the party with the highest number of percentage for women, they'll support that party, so that if the party is supposed to give, say, 25% of their seat to women, women will support that. Then the women will now send in 25% of that particular seats allocated for the party based on their performance. So in that way, that's why you can see in most East African countries and some of the countries in West Africa, even in South Africa, you can see so many women in parliament because they didn't go to contest the election with anybody. The party contested the election, they benefited because they supported the party, you know. So in that way, we're encouraging the youth, the women, and all that. As long as we're not doing that, our women will continue to suffer representation in the National Assembly and State Assembly, even the youth as well. So this issue of not too young to run, at the time it came up, I told them, well, we're going to deal with that, but it's not going to solve your problem. What to solve your problem is proportional representation. So I just needed to make this clarification.
Thank you very much. Before I come to Aisha, because I want to let you to actually go as we're rounding up. Just two things. It's also a question from the audience. Nigerians are, wondering why will the Ninth National Assembly be proceeding on recess when what do you call it? We already had COVID-19 that had already chopped off a lot of time from us. And why can't people wait and deal with the Electoral, Act amendment? That's number one. Number two, all over the world, the seat of the Senate is usually like the seat of wisdom of any nation. Whereby you're going to have where you have very old people sometimes, making laws. United States of America, for example. In addition, we've listened to you, and you have been one person who has been very deep in constitutional issues in the affairs of Nigeria. In case there is no higher calling, in case there is no higher calling for 2023, will you reconsider remaining in the National Assembly? Because this is the kind of knowledge that actually deepens, the development of a nation. In case there is no higher calling, probably you want to contest for a different thing, will you consider remaining in the Senate of Federal Republic of Nigeria, simply because we know that issue of reforms, electoral reform, constitutional review, will continue to be an issue that continues to agitate. And Nigerians having invested in you as one of the longest serving senators, will you reconsider saying that, look, I still need to give back, to the people of Nigeria in case you are re-elected by your constituency, that, look, we need to continue to make good laws for the benefit of Nigeria?
Well, thank you so much for those compliments. Let me start with the earlier issue you raised regarding whether we need to go on break or not. We are serving our people. If there's any reason, for us to stay back to attend to any law, I'm sure the leadership of National Assembly will have any problem dealing with that. So I'm not part of the leadership, so I leave that to their decision. So if they say we stay back and deal with the Electoral Act or any other legislation or any other issue concerning the country, it will be my pleasure to stay behind to join my colleagues. Then the last issue you raised about whether I could consider coming back to the Senate. Well, I've made that clear that I've made my own contributions, I've tried, and it will be time to yield to younger people or maybe other people to come and make their own contributions. Nobody is indispensable. So I think it's time for me to move on and allow other people make their own contribution anyway. So, but you see, all this power belongs to God, and they take the issue on the affairs of men. So I've just spoken as an individual, as a human being. So the issue of what I become tomorrow is in the hands of God. So, so it's not for me to be definite, but I've said what I want as an individual. But what to happen is what God wants.
Thank you, the former Deputy Senate President. 1 minute, let me just allow Aisha, so as a matter of course, just make a submission. Aisha, now that we've heard from you, we heard from Senator Ekweremadu, what do you think is the way forward for those of us in the CSOs? What's your advice in terms of how to continue to press the National Assembly to actually achieve this? Once you have been long in this this sector, what do you think we should do?
Something innovative that civil society should be thinking about is a people's bill. To be honest, I've wondered why we're so passive about. From the interest in this conversation to the comments and the questions that have been asked in the chat rooms, obviously this is a topic that many people care about, and we see it trending on social media many times. So why have Nigerians, not enough committed Nigerians, we don't need too many, even 1% of Nigerians, come together to back a people's bill, to insist to their representatives in the National Assembly who are there to represent them and their views. So for me, that would be an innovation that would be really interesting to see, and to see what Nigerians think. We also need our tech, for me, it would be how civil society working with the tech industry, whether it's our Silicon Valley in Yaba or whatever, to find out innovative and cheap ways ahead of time of how we can do this electronic voting with our own homegrown solutions, instead of waiting for INEC and the executive to bring huge bills to us, which we will be bearing the cost of. So for me, those are some of the things that I think we should be thinking about. We all need to think seriously. But I'd like more participation. This should not be something that's led entirely by the National Assembly. I think they're part, as many well-meaning people are there, they're also part of the problem. They too also win elections. They also know how elections are won. We should sort of dilute their power by sharing clearly what we want as people.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of this very, very important virtual conference. We cannot thank Senator Ekweremadu enough for sparing his time. We're really, really grateful for us at Center for Liberty. I will have allowed one of my colleagues to do that, but I think our time is fast spent. And let me say, I think Aisha said something, sir, if you listen to her very well. And I think you also being an apostle of the common man, with your feeding bottle, federalism that you've talked about severally. Aisha said something very important in her closing remark, that it should be called the People's Bill. And if we have your support, we think that when you get to the National Assembly, sir, it's very important for you to make your colleagues and your friends to see the Electoral Act amendment as the People's Bill. Because henceforth, I think we're going to also talk to some of our colleagues in the CSOs to see it as the People's Bill. And that's what we want the Senate to actually consider. So, sir, we'll be very glad. Having listened to us, listen to Nigerians, that this should now be called the People's Bill, so that they can actually consider what is actually in the interest of Nigerians. So I want to thank Aisha for gifting us with this very important idea. I want to thank the distinguished senator for actually participating in this very important seminar. We would like to have you one more time in the next couple of months or thereabout, because Nigeria is work in progress. A lot of things, should be said about our country. There are a lot of corrections that should be made. And we believe that we can always count on your profound wisdom, your experience, and your contribution, to our nation. So on behalf of those of us at Center for Liberty, our participants, and Nigerians who are yearning and eager to have electoral reform, we want to say thank you very much, for attending this very important webinar. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, man.
I appreciate. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.